This week, as President Trump and President Xi try to work out a broad trade deal, we'll drill down to the details. VMware's Chief Operating Officer Sanjay Poonen tells us about the actual experiences Silicon Valley leaders are having in China. Plus, the future of factories as robots and new technologies change the face of work. And a former Amazon executive asks what Jeff Bezos would do. Our reporters, Market Watch's John Swartz and Richard Waters from London's Financial Times, this week on Press Here. Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott McGrew. There may be 20 countries at the G20 summit this weekend, but our eyes are on just two of them, the United States and China. President Trump and Chinese President Xi face a trade war, tariffs, and the question of intellectual property. The talks may be at the conference in Japan or in Beijing or in Washington, but their effects are felt in Silicon Valley. VMware's Chief Operating Officer, Sanjay Poonen, is just back from China, where he hosted VMware's Partner Leadership Forum. Sanjay is joining us now. China, also the home to VMware's locations in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong. Sanjay is in charge of all of them, joined by John Swartz of Dow Jones, Richard Waters of the Financial Times. I kind of want to debrief you on your most recent trip to China. In the hotel bar, and you're talking with your Chinese counterparts who work for your company, and those who don't, maybe some of your clients, what are they saying behind closed doors?
Yeah, thanks, Scott, for having me on the show. I think, listen, first off, I think it was important that a executive of VMware, CEO, came to show up. I think they were trying to get a sense of who's going to show up here. Is it you're going to send some low-level person or a senior executive? So I went there deliberately to reassure first our employees, we care first about our employees, and then partners and customers that we're committed to our customers there. And it always starts with that, committed with our customers. While we've got to comply with U.S. law, which affects certain partners, there's a vast number of other customers and partners that we want to reassure that we're committed to their business.
And tell me how you reassure them and what they respond. I mean, I'm talking the granular level over, what are their concerns, what are your concerns, and how do you explain what's happening here in the United States? How do they explain it back to you, what's going on in Beijing?
Yeah, first off, to our employees, they want to know they're going to have a job. Are you going to fire them just because of this stuff or not? And we want to make sure, because it all starts with your employees. A company takes care of their employees, employee takes care of their customers. We have a lot of good employees there. So that was important, and that's the top of their concern. I'm going to do a call later this evening with those employees again to reassure them. But with partners and customers, they want to know your roadmap. Where are you going? Are you building product that's specific for us? Are you going to continue to support us when we have support escalations, or are you going to abandon us? And that's being there.
I mean, as Scott was saying, I think what's really interesting to me right now in this environment we're in is that there are two stories of what's happening in the world. There's a US story and a China story. And the Huawei situation, I don't think I've ever seen a rift between two narratives as strong as this. There is outrage in China over what's happening. There is a very strong belief, not only in China, but in many parts of the world, that the US is acting out of entire self-interest here. And I mean, it's causing, you must get on the ground there and hear people must be saying to you, but what is the US doing? Why are you doing this to our country? I mean, it must be going quite deep in your organization. I mean, how do you respond to that?
I mean, actually, the Chinese people I found to be very measured in their approach, but maybe they weren't being as honest right to my face. But we found them to be very measured. I mean, they understand, listen, the Huawei situation doesn't apply to every customer and partner there.
Right.
And from our perspective, there's parts of Huawei we compete with, and those parts that are software, we actually have a better solution. So we can obviously show those customers where VMware overlaps with Huawei. Virtualization provides you freedom, so that's good. But for the many other customers and partners who depend on other parts of our technology stack, the most important thing is assuring them that you're going to support them, that the software is going to continue to run, and that you will be with them through tough times and good times. And that's what I sought to do there with customers and partners.
There are going to be so many different segments of the tech industry watching this closely. I think about Apple, with about 20% of their revenue comes from China. I think yours about more than 11%. I think.
No, it's less than that. So we don't have as much. We're not as exposed as some of the hardware companies of that. But it's an important country.
But I think of the semiconductor stocks were surging based on some movement with Micron and Huawei. And it seems as if the Chinese government's going to insist the U.S. lift the ban as part of this trade truce. So I'm wondering, this offers an opportunity, but also it's terrifying to other companies. I mean, it's an opportunity for a Cisco that competes with Huawei, but with companies with deep commitments to China, it must be kind of a terrifying moment.
Yeah, I mean, listen, again, like I said, for our employees, we want to make sure we're taking care of them. We're not as exposed as hardware companies, but compared to some other software companies, we have more opportunity, and we want to say that. But it's also important to us that we don't alienate the U.S. government. So this is a needle we've got to thread, because the last thing we want to do is have the U.S. government think that we are not complying with U.S. law, and it affects then our federal business. So we've got to make sure that, first off, we're not doing anything that takes a political stand one way or the other. That's not us as we're business people. We're technologists. And that way we can ensure that we're complying with U.S. law, which is important as it relates to Huawei and others, but at the same time serving China customers. And our hope is in the long term, these trade issues will resolve and we get back to doing business.
As no doubt I hope they will, but as we were talking about exposure, obviously if you were to lose your access to China, just theoretically, you would lose your clients in China. What's the opposite? What is VMware's exposure to China as far as things coming out of China? Would you be affected if that were some?
We're not as exposed because we don't source a lot of material. We have Chinese employees there who are building code, but we don't actually source. We're not a hardware company that sources materials, and in that sense we're less exposed.
Yeah.
Now, we were told we can't employ anybody in China, right, or so and so, which I don't think we're going to get to. But from the standpoint of the fact that we can hopefully we want to continue to do business there, that's important to us.
Yeah. I mean, flipping it around the other way, the other interesting kind of question coming out of the trade talks that are now going on is whether access to local markets will be opened up for companies like yours. And when you think about the cloud computing market in China, it's very underdeveloped, right, compared with the US and most of the developed world. I mean, it's a massive opportunity, and yet at the moment, American cloud companies are essentially shut out. They have to go through partners there and so on. So from your point of view, you're looking presumably at potentially a huge market. How do you assess that right now? Where's the upside for you coming out of these talks?
Yeah, Richard, that's a good point. And now, one of the things that benefit VMware, we don't fly as high as some of the other big consumer brands.
Right.
In terms of getting the attention. We're smaller, but also very successful. Secondly, we're sort of a software provider to any cloud. So quite frankly, many of those cloud providers in China can use our software, and they are. So we announced a partnership last year with Alibaba. They're the most successful cloud company in China. They can use our software, and we have a partnership with them, China Mobile. So the key is, when you think about many of these companies, I noticed I didn't mention Huawei, many of them are VMware customers, and they're not being targeted by this ban. So to the extent that we can continue to serve those customers, serve those partners, there's an opportunity for us to play in the cloud computing growth in China in a positive fashion.
And it's at a very early stage, though.
Very early stage, and
very early
I think there's as much an
relative to the
opportunity for an Alibaba or some of those other private clouds to be successful in China as there is for AWS and Azure and Google here in the US.
So if this problem continues and lingers, do you see companies, maybe not yours perhaps, but others, and I'm thinking about Apple, which is increasingly looking into services and being less reliant on the hardware side. Do you see other companies maybe starting to slowly pivot to kind of a different alternative that's less dependent on China?
I think, listen, I can't give advice to every company. Certainly the hardware economies, ones who are sourcing materials in hardware economies and have to think about what they're. My advice to executives, listen, first off, you've got to make sure you've got a diversified geographical base of your revenue so that you're coming from multiple countries and growing your entire Asia base.
Because usually China's usually the second largest country now among some of
for
the
many companies. It's not for us, okay, but for many companies. And in software, you have a little bit more exposure to other countries because the software economy in China is still growing. The hardware economy is a little bit more mature there in terms of its penetration there, but the software is still early. So many of us software companies, I'd put us and Salesforce and Adobe, and these are all very successful software companies in that $10 to $20 billion range. We're still seeing a lot of opportunity, and China is not yet our number 2 country. So we still have a lot of growth in other regions, and we'll play the China situation out over a multi-year period.
Sanjay, I only have a little bit of time left, so I'm going to hog the last 2 questions. First one is, you have offices in Beijing, you have offices in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's in the special administrative region. We've seen a lot of interesting stuff come out of Hong Kong lately. Do you notice differences in the employees between the two and how they approach business?
There are certainly, a little bit more of a Western influence among our Hong Kong-based folks. They all have to obviously speak the language, but I think in the millennial generation, Scott, things are really starting to. The world's flat. I mean, I think in terms of thinking about Tom Friedman's, but I think that the Chinese students that I talk to are in their 20s. You can't tell if they've grown up in American University, Hong Kong, or not. They speak English reasonably fluently. They think very much like the tech companies of today. So those barriers and those differences are starting to change. But in the older generation, the folks in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there is a difference between the folks that are in Hong Kong and in Beijing, Shanghai.
Well, speaking of the world, I know you are a huge cricket fan.
How can you not be?
How could you not be? Yes.
The insect or the game?
Okay, yes. So without going into detail, if I tune in cricket and I watch India, what am I watching? What's the exciting thing that I should be watching for in cricket? Sell me on cricket.
I'm not sure I can sell you, but I'll try.
Okay.
But here's the deal, right? It's the one sport because of India and Pakistan, many of these countries, a lot of people, that has the most viewers. And the India-Pakistan team has like 1 billion people watching it.
It's phenomenal.
You would know maybe a little bit. So here's the deal. It's a game that's similar to baseball. Okay, very quick entree. You kind of, rather than 4 bases, you've got 2
Nothing's
stumps.
quick about baseball.
Okay.
Yeah.
This game's a little longer than baseball.
Yeah.
Oh, it
imagine
could be
that.
a whole day or a half day or 5 days.
I once watched a one-day
You got
match
30
where there was
seconds.
no winner.
No winner, yes.
Okay, where do I
Sell me
start?
in 30 seconds.
Go watch the game
It's
this
a very,
weekend.
can I just say it's a
Yes.
very American thing to want a winner. But I think Sanjay is absolutely right here that it's essentially baseball with better manners.
Watch the games this weekend. India and Australia, the 2 best teams in a World Cup cricket tournament going on in the next few weeks. Best time to learn. Watch the games. You'll probably learn a little bit.
Sanjay Poonen of VMware, thanks for being with
Thank you,
us this
Scott.
morning. Coming up, make a new plan, Stan. There are 50 ways to think like Amazon when Press Here continues.